This is the Wisdom Podcast.
Welcome to the Wisdom Podcast. My name is Daniel Aiken, and this week we meet Theravada Buddhist teacher Shaila Catherine. Shaila Catherine has been practicing meditation since 1980 and teaching since 1996. And she's author of 2 books, Focused and Fearless, and also Wisdom Wide and Deep. Shaila has over 8 years of accumulated silent retreat experience. And so in today's conversation, we spend a lot of time speaking about the deeper states of meditation, the Jhanas, and how they might be applicable to the modern meditator. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Shaila. Been practicing meditation since 1980, and I was wondering how you first got into meditation practice, and was that Buddhist meditation that you started with, or something else?
Well, I actually started meditation when I was in high school.
Oh, wow.
And so at that point, I didn't know that I would be interested in Buddhism. I just knew I wanted to meditate. And so I did what anybody would do at that time in history before we had the internet, is I went to the yellow pages. So I opened the telephone book, looked in the yellow pages under M for meditation, and there were 3 choices.
Wow.
And so my mother picked which one we were going to go to based upon the neighborhood. The Zen Center was in a lousy neighborhood, but there was a TM Center that was in a nicer neighborhood.
Do you remember the third option? So you had Zen, TM.
I don't remember what the other one was. But I remember that there were 3 and that she picked it. And we didn't know anything, but she picked it just based upon the neighborhood.
Okay.
So I went to a TM Center in a suburb. And I did that practice for a few years until I met somebody who had just come back from a silent retreat. Uh-huh. So I was in college by that time. Mm-hmm. And I had been meditating twice a day, every day. Yeah. And was loving the meditation. And I was so eager to experience what this silence was. Wow. So as soon as I had heard about the possibility of a silent retreat, I just badgered this person until I got all the information, and I immediately started attending insight meditation retreats, vipassana retreats. And it felt like I had found what I had been searching for. Wow. As soon as I had gone to my first retreat, there were teachings on the Dhamma, there were teachings on the Four Noble Truths, there were teachings on a path that I didn't even realize. I just knew I wanted to meditate. I knew I loved the meditation, but I didn't realize the teachings of Dhamma and insight that were possible. So at the end of that retreat, I signed up for another one, and then I signed up for another one, and then I signed up for another one, and have basically been doing retreats ever since.
Doing that ever since. Yeah. And so was the silence everything you thought it would be, or do you remember that, like, a lot of people have these stories about being confronted with all their thoughts when they go into silence, or was it not like that? Was it a pleasant retreat for you?
It was a very difficult retreat in terms of sitting pain. I was not used to sitting still and just being with my experience. I did have to be with my own emotional and mental thoughts in a way I had never realized before, and it was somewhat shocking, if not humiliating, to look into the mind deeply for perhaps the first time in my life. But I think at that age, I was very young. I mean, I was still, maybe was I 19 or 20?
19, yeah.
Maybe 21. Somewhere, it was in my early years in college. And I had a sense of adventure. So that kind of inner exploration was thrilling to me. It made no difference that it was really hard. That wasn't the slightest bit of discouragement. Yeah. It actually told me that there was something rich there. Yeah. There was some kind of grit to work with. And sure, there was the physical pain, sure, there was the mental pain, but there was a path of something that I could, even on that first retreat, taste a depth of healing, a depth of peace, and a depth of happiness that I did not even know was possible, that was just so far beyond any kind of sensual experience of that kind of deep spiritual peace. So...
And then, so the TM meditation that you were originally doing in high school, was that like some mantra recitation? And then in this retreat, what type of meditations did they have you doing?
We were doing a mindfulness practice, mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of mind, mindfulness of mental states, just mindfulness of whatever the experience was in the present moment.
And so then did your practice become more that going forward after that retreat, or were you still doing the TM, or was it... What was your practice looking? Did something change for you then?
From that point forward, for about a decade, I did mindfulness practices, and quite intensively and diligently. Started attending long retreats, 3-month retreats, and then after college, I went to graduate school, and then before I quite finished graduate school, I went to Asia and continued to practice. Then I came back briefly to finish graduate school because I just felt like I wanted the karma of completing. Yeah, I just wanted to not leave that hanging as a loose end in my life. So I finished it off and then bought a one-way ticket back to Asia and spent about a little less than a decade abroad, primarily practicing in India, in Thailand, and a little bit in Nepal.
Okay, and so over this time, you've spent about 9 years in retreat. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and then so of course you build up to these things. So you started with 1 week retreats, and then 1 month, and then 3 months. And how did you build? Or did you suddenly one day just say, I know retreats are for me, and I'm going to sign away for 6 months? Or how did that evolve for you?
I'm more of a gradual kind of kind of approach. So yes, I started with the 10-day retreat. That was my first retreat, and then for several years I just attended. Well, I'm not sure, maybe less than several years, but a number of years I just attended 10-day, week-long, 2-week retreats, and then a 3-week retreat, and then I don't remember if it was a 6-week or a 3-month retreat. And I did a number of built up like that until I decided to go to Asia.
Yeah. And then where were you going?
I went first to Bodh Gaya.
Okay.
Where the Buddha was awakened.
Yes.
And practiced a retreat at the Thai temple that a teacher from England, Christopher Titmuss, was leading. And then after that retreat, I met some friends who were sitting with a teacher, H.W.L. Poonja. We called him affectionately Papaji.
Papaji.
And at that time, there were just a few friends with him, maybe 5 or 6 people.
Yeah.
And I was just deeply touched, deeply moved in that meeting with him. And so it turned my plans around. I had gone to Asia with an itinerary, which I know is a joke. But I thought, I'd practice in this place, and then I'd go to that monastery, and I'd go to this country and that country and see this place and that place. But I just basically went to Bodh Gaya, and then I went to Lucknow, and then I just stayed with Poonjaji.
Wow. How long were you with him for?
Over the course, I met him at the beginning of 1990. And he died in 1997. And during that time, I spent more than 3 years living with him. And he treated me very much like a granddaughter. I mean, I moved into his house, was maybe something of an attendant. And so it was an extraordinary opportunity to be so close to a master and to experience that life day in and day out from morning till night. So that was quite an extraordinary opportunity. In the last few years of his life, as the community around him grew and it was no longer a small, intimate experience, it was really a thriving and large, more ashram-like scene. It wasn't so much to my taste. So I began to travel more I'd go to Thailand, spend time in the monasteries there practicing, and then I started to spend less time in India with him. But I still was basically going back and forth throughout his life.
And what sort of meditations were you doing with him, or what was practice like with him?
Poonjaji didn't teach meditation.
So what sort of practice was it then? Like, what was your practice? Serving? Was it just being with him? What drew you? So what kept you there then?
It's hard to find the right words to describe it, because he didn't teach a practice in the sense of a discipline, and yet he was one of the most disciplined. The environment of living with him was the most disciplined and the strongest renunciation I had ever practiced anywhere. It made the Thai monasteries feel luxurious.
Wow.
So he was very disciplined, very strict, very loving.
Yeah.
And what kept me there? Love.
Devotion for
gratitude.
Did you consider him like a guru?
Totally.
Yeah.
He would work with somebody's mind in a way that's impossible to describe in words.
Wow.
And take the mind to a place of peace or freedom that most people had never known was possible before.
So here's the thing. You just made me even more curious. And I know there's no words to describe, but can you do you remember a time of like a story of a time with him that might give a sense of what you're talking about?
The stories don't hold up very well as stories.
Too ordinary.
I don't think. No, I could say there was a time when I was sitting and talking with him, and he asked me a question. And then there was this extraordinary happiness.
Okay, good.
So what kind of a story is that?
Well,
there was also like he one of the things that he was very direct about was asking people what they wanted. So I think that maybe after I had met him once or twice, he quite directly asked, "What do you want?"
Yes.
And it's interesting when somebody who is quite a powerful human being asks you what you want. I was shocked to hear what I said. And then I wondered, that's interesting, because I just blurted out at the moment that I wanted the experience of emptiness.
Yeah. Wow.
And so
what was
he
the
said,
response?
okay, and then he went on to the next person and talked with somebody else.
Yeah.
And another day or so later, I noticed a gradual shift in my own experience, because, I had wanted to get enlightened under the Bodhi tree in a very Buddhist way.
Yeah.
I had not been on the path of guru devotion. That was not within my worldview.
Yeah.
So it was rather shocking to me to realize that I was really deeply, deeply moved by a possibility that he opened before I'd say my eyes, but it was really opening my mind.
Wow.
I've described it. I described it to him, and I've described it since in the same way, that it was like in conversation he was able to take the subject away from the object and leave it there. Leave the mind there without any clinging, without any of the formations that we usually conceive of things. I like this. I am doing that. I intend blank. There's this subject-object relationship. And he just could work with somebody in a way that could shift that habitual way of relating to experience.
Yeah.
And then it was possible to then keep perceiving experience from that, you could say, a non-dual place, an empty place, a free place. What is that? I don't know. And people often ask, well, is that the same as awakening in the Buddhist tradition? I don't know. I finally gave up at some point of trying to map the experiences that I had with Poonjaji over the years with the path of awakening in the Theravada tradition, because the languages are different. It's hard to say, but I know I feel deep, deep gratitude for the time that I spent with Poonjaji. And I also know that at a certain point, what was right for me was to dive in to the meditation and to refine the foundational practices, methodology, techniques in meditation, to learn to work with the mind in a more precise and skilled way. And so I started emphasizing much more time doing Theravada practices, first in the monasteries in Thailand, and then picking up intensive retreat practice in the West. Actually, in many ways, sitting retreats in the West was certainly as profound, if not more profound, for me than practicing in Asia, simply because we have some really stunning retreat centers here where you can spend time in silence with teachers who speak the same language as I speak. So I could learn a lot and practice very, very deeply in the West. So the combination of having the blessings of meeting teachers who are remarkable teachers in Asia and the opportunities to use the facilities and the guidance of the wisdom that is really within our Buddhist culture, the Western Buddhist culture. I feel very fortunate in the development of my practice.
And part of having experienced both the being at the temples in Thailand and being, in the West, you're not missing out on anything, right? Because there could be this idea that, okay, I've done my retreats in California or whatever, now I need to go to Thailand or something like that. But you had experienced, you'd already done that. You'd already been to India, you've already been to Thailand, you've had a significant amount of meditation, and then you realize that when you're here in the West that the conditions are just fine or great. There's teachers here, and so you can just get down to practice it, I imagine.
Yeah. And it's not to say that that one could replace the other, but for me, the combination of the two.
The combination, okay.
Was and is quite a powerful combination.
Yeah. It's you talk about your time in India with the guru, and it is sometimes you can understand when you're with these people, these great beings, is that like the ordinary can be so profound. And I was sort of struck by the question. Yeah, like what was it? It was, what do you want?
What do you want?
Now, like, you could take that question as a practice for years. Like, what is it I want, as a reflection? Like, that's such an ordinary question, but really could lead to some profound places in terms of insight about yourself.
Yeah.
So that's I really appreciate that story.
I don't think we should minimize the importance of the ordinary.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that the very fact that awakening, Bodhi, it's an awakening. It's an ordinary term. We all wake up in the morning. It's relatively ordinary.
Yeah.
And the world that we work with in meditation is the world of the senses.
Yeah.
We're not trying to have some kind of weird mystical experience every time we meditate.
Yeah.
It's about how do we relate to the experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, feeling, emotions, cognizing, mind states, thoughts. How do we relate to experience?
Yeah.
That's what we wake up with, and that's what the field of practice is utterly ordinary things.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody sees, hears, smells. Well, if you have the faculty that works, most people have these sense faculties, and that's what the practice is about. So to think that meditation is some kind of odd, extreme practice is a real misunderstanding, or that awakening should be separated from life. It's very much about how we perceive this moment. Is our perception distorted? diluted, infused with ignorance? Or do we meet our experience as it is, free from clinging, free from confusion, with a kind of our heart and mind open, without all of the self-delusions of living in our own stories that many people who have not done any inner work are caught by. And it's often the first insights that people have when they sit down and look at the mind, is to distinguish between the story of something and a more direct experience of it.
Yeah.
And then as it becomes subtler and subtler, we start to see the subtle ways that conceit, conceiving, I formations affect the perception of experience.
No, I have to agree with you, like, for the very reason of the translation of Bodhi as enlightenment. I much prefer awakening. It seems to get at, like, enlightenment can seem like this mystical thing where, like you said, we all wake up every day. So hopefully. So I do think that's an important point, and it can bring us closer to feeling like this is something we can do, or something we can try and practice now.
Yeah.
And so you were so then you got into some fairly long retreats. So you were silent for a year at some point, and in retreat for a large amount of that time, I'm imagining, if not all of it. So can you tell us about some of the longer retreats and what you were thinking going into that, and what you were trying to do, and how you were doing it?
Well, I've always had, as I said, I have always had a deep love for retreat practice. And so there was a period of time, maybe 10 or 12 years, maybe 15 years, where I made a commitment to sit at least 3 months a year in silence. So it would be formal meditation practice in silence, usually in a retreat center. And then at some point I really wanted to see what would happen with a longer, deeper retreat. So I tried to schedule a year-long retreat, but in reality it turned out to be 10 months. Then for some medical things I had to leave and then come back to finish my other 2 months. So it's still a long retreat, 10 months. So that was the longest I spent in consecutively in a silent retreat.
Yeah.
And during that time, I decided that I would sort of warm up my retreat with a little bit of concentration practice.
Yeah.
So I thought, the first month or two, I'll emphasize a bit of concentration. I had read much about the practices called Jhana, which are deep absorption states that one attains systematically to strengthen the concentration and increase the stability of mind. So I thought, okay, I'll do these Samadhi practices, these Jhana practices, learn that and in that way kind of warm up my retreat. But what I quickly found was that they were very interesting, and that the methods and techniques that were involved in developing concentration and the benefits and value of sustaining and exploring these jhana states, they're like altered states of deep concentration, was so rich that I wanted to give much more time to it. So in that 10-month retreat, I ended up giving the almost the entire retreat was devoted to the development of jhana and exploring in particular how to use the concentrated mind, the jhana mind, for insight practice. Because it's not so valuable to just enter into a jhana and just hang out there. Okay, sure, it's fun. I encourage anybody to try it because it's fun.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with enjoying your practice, and there's nothing wrong with being able to have a pleasant abiding.
Yeah.
But the concentration states have the benefit of purifying mindfulness and creating such a profound stability of mind that it enhances the vipassana practice, the insight meditation practice that we're then able to do.
Yeah.
So I explored jhana as a basis for insight, primarily for that 10-month retreat.
And is that the retreat that your book, Focused and Fearless, came out of, or was that another retreat?
No, it was that retreat.
Okay.
In fact, it was at the end of that retreat that one of my various teachers had given me some instruction and guidance and support through that retreat. And one of the teachers said to me that she did not know anybody who had done these practices at that time. That was in 2003 to 2004.
Yeah.
She said she didn't know anybody in the West who had done those practices to the depth and extent that I had done them.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was very little that was written about it. So I had to actually figure out a lot myself.
Yeah.
I had to experiment, which means experimenting. What does it mean? It means trying something and
seeing if it works.
Yeah, which means wasting a lot of time, actually.
Yeah,
okay, I learned a lot because I not only learned what worked, I learned what didn't work.
Yeah.
But I had 10 months to play with that, and most people who go into retreat don't want to do the experimentation, and nor should they have to.
Yeah.
So she strongly encouraged me to write a book to share what I had learned in that retreat about developing concentration, and in particular how to enter and master the 4 jhanas. I used the breath as the primary object. And then after doing the jhana practice with the 4 what are called material jhanas, using the breath as the basis, then I went on to establish and explore the what are called the immaterial or arupa states, the immaterial states, which are based, they're deep absorption states based upon perceptions of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, or a state that's called neither perception nor non-perception.
So we maybe start there. If you could explain that to us, that would be great. Just joking.
But it is interesting. Sometimes people want to go to the highest. That's the big danger with these kinds of linear systems that start with 1, then go to 2, then go to 3, then go to 4, because it makes people think that, they want to rush through it, and that they're not... that to feel a sense of self-worth, they have to get to, this goal. And it's way too abstract.
Yeah, and maybe a lower level of concentration is sufficient for the insight practice. I don't know how you feel about that. Like, so myself coming from the Tibetan tradition, you hear that, okay, there's a certain level of concentration you're required, maybe access level or something like that before the first jhana. That's enough, and then we should do insight practice. Whereas, I remember I had a friend who was a student of one of my Tibetan teachers, and then he wanted to go and try Theravada meditation. And he's a serious guy, so he just goes and he'll go into a retreat for a long time. And so, he was with quite a good, an amazing teacher actually in the Theravada tradition, and so we caught up. So I called him after one of his long retreats, and basically so what are you doing, and what's happening? And then he talked, and it sounds so foreign to me. So he starts saying, well, there's this thing called nimitta, and I'm like, well, what's that? And he's like, well, it's this white line, right? And then, that's normally considered a distraction for us. Don't you just go back to your meditation? He's like, no, this will get you into the jhana state. And so every time I met a Theravadan person, I'm like, oh, tell me about nimitta. Tell me about jhanas. And really, it wasn't until I read your book, that I really started to get some sense of what's happening here. And what I was most wanting to know is how one goes from, a couple of questions, how one goes from relying on the breath, which is also a feeling. So in the consciousness, it's the feeling sense, right? Whereas the deep levels of concentrations are reliant on the mental consciousness rather than sense consciousness. And so how one goes from the sense of feeling basis of concentration and to the deeper levels of mental concentration, how the Theravadans did that. And then when I read your book, and I could have got it totally wrong, but it feels like that the nimitta And one instruction in there you gave is like you start getting people to move rather than the sensations, what the breath is like, to the continuation of the concentration. And when I read you give that instruction, I felt, oh, okay, here's the platform to move into the mental concentration from the sense concentration. That's how they do it. And then the Nimitta came along, and I thought, oh, okay, that's the link. And so then I wanted to so now I'm talking to the person who wrote the book. I wanted to get your reflections on what I understood and yeah, if that.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I really enjoy about the jhana practices is they offer a very clear technology for meditation.
Yeah.
And there are certain skills, meditative skills that one develops. And as these meditative skills become clearer and stronger and more refined, and even one develops mastery in these various skills, then it enables us to work with the mind in, one could say, a more skillful way, but a very precise way.
Yeah.
And so there's a part of my character, one people often tell me, that likes the precision and the technology of it. So basically you learn certain things. You learn ways to work with the mind. You learn how to apply it to various objects. And the skill with the object is a very important skill that we develop in the concentration practices. So first, the instruction I usually give is for people to direct their attention to the breath in the area of the nostrils and the upper lip area. And to first just notice how they feel the breath. As you said, it can be known as a sensory experience. And as you begin to direct your attention and stay with the observation of the in-breath and the out-breath, balancing the energy, letting go of distraction, working with whatever hindrances might arise, basically doing all the things one would do in any meditative practice, we're still giving attention to the breath in this area. As the distractions fade, as the hindrances fall away, we are more strongly and more consistently simply knowing the breath. And it's possible to allow in the way that we perceive the object, the way that we hold the breath as our object, make a subtle shift so that we're no longer enhancing the physicality of the breath, the sensory touch sensations or the heat or the cold, but we're simply knowing breath as breath. And then the mind can become quite stable knowing breath as breath, even without the support of the physical sensations.
Yes, that seems crucial. Yeah.
But most people have to allow this to develop gradually and to have some equanimity with however we know the breath. Because it does no good to think, oh, it's more refined to just hold on to the breath as breath, so I'm not going to deal with those sensations. We have to be with what the experience is. And if the mind is restless, if there's thoughts, if there's agitation, or if just the factors of concentration and energy haven't come to that kind of sweet balance, then it's better to stay with the sensations than it is to go off just in distracting thoughts.
Exactly.
So we use the sensations to ground the attention. But when we are no longer distracted, then we can allow the object of the meditation to become refined. And there is a sequence of refinement of the object or the sign of concentration, which is the nimitta. Nimitta is translated simply as sign. But we tend to use it to refer to the transformation of the meditation object, what we are giving our attention to. So first it might be to physical sensations of that subtle warmth on the out-breath and that subtle coolness on the in-breath, or that tingling vibration that people might feel. And then we might just know a steadiness of attention with breath. And then as our concentration becomes stronger and stronger, sometimes the breath disappears. And we'd say, I can't feel the breath. Well, we don't need to fill that gap with other things. We don't need to now go to other sensations
Yes.
in the body, or start to create concepts or pictures.
Yeah.
People try to fill in that space with an awful lot of things,
Yeah.
and all of that is a distraction. All we need to do is keep directing and sustaining our attention to the place we last knew the breath.
Yeah.
And when I say the place, I don't necessarily mean a dot
Yeah.
or a tiny little place.
Yeah.
This can be a relatively broad or a general experience. Some people have a very expansive sense of the
Really?
breath that nevertheless gives us a place to direct the attention,
Yeah.
as though this area around the nostrils and upper lip area is like the center of a field of awareness.
Yeah.
So I just want to be careful. Some people misunderstand me and think that I'm talking about like some little spot
Little
at the tip of their
atom.
nose. Yeah, I mean, it's not like that at all.
It can be
And
very...
then as the attention becomes more steady in the way that we are consistently directing and sustaining attention, then for many people, there's a further refinement, because the mind needs an object, it needs something to know.
Yeah.
And so the mind, a concentrated mind usually becomes quite luminous.
Yes.
And so there can be like a transformation of the meditation object from the physicality to a sense of steadiness, to a kind of congealing or coherence of the mind with a luminosity.
Yeah.
And it varies person to person. It doesn't need to be exactly the same. But when I teach people to develop and master the jhanas, when I teach a jhana retreat, I listen very carefully for how a student describes the progression of the development of this nimitta.
Yeah.
What happens before? What happens at the end of the sitting? How long does the mind stay with it? What else arises with those mental states or doesn't? To give me clues to sense whether or not that is indeed the genuine nimitta of the breath.
Of the breath. So,
And not just an abstract kind of sense of the concentrated mind.
Yeah.
Because the concentrated mind is bright for many
yeah.
people, no matter what the object is. But only certain objects are suitable for absorption.
okay, so you say nimitta of the breath, we can say sign of the breath, right?
Yeah.
And so why would you equate the luminosity of this state? Why would you relate that to the breath?
Well, when one is developing it, one will move back and forth between the knowing of the breath in other ways.
Yes.
And the luminosity that develops along with it, so that the very knowing of the breath becomes one with, becomes merged with, or it's clear to the meditator that that sign is derived from the knowing of the breath.
Yeah.
And this is a very important thing for each meditator to check, so that we don't just sit down and think light.
Yeah, of course.
That's not the breath nimitta.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe you could go into the light casino,
Yeah.
but it's a totally different
Different
practice, a different object. There's
Yeah.
then no skill with the object.
It's not related to the concentration. It's not developed out of the concentration on the breath.
Right, and the breath isn't the only object that we can
Yeah.
develop concentration with. There are many other meditation objects taught in the Theravada tradition that support the jhanas:
Well,
loving kindness, compassion, colors, elements,
Yeah.
and concepts like space, like
Yes.
consciousness.
Yeah.
Those can all support it. So it's very clear that we know what meditation object we are starting with,
Yeah.
and that the nimitta that we take, which is the mental sign of that
that.
object,
Yeah.
is derived from that object and not something else.
Yeah, and this was something that occurred to me while reading your book as well, because the way I'd thought and talked to Theravada practitioners, I was like, okay, there's an advantage and a disadvantage of using the breath as a point of concentration, or as a foundation of concentration. And so the disadvantage I'd already talked about is that I felt like it felt a little bit too gross for me to get real deep concentration, because it was based on the senses. But then I read your book and your like instruction to sort of move to the continuation of the breathing rather than the sensation of it. I felt like, okay, there's the bridge.
Yeah.
The advantage of it was, as opposed to some other sort of meditations I was known to do, is that the breath's always there, right? So when you're doing a visualization practice, for example, which I think you can get very strong concentration from,
Yes.
because you need so much effort to create a construction, but then keep the relaxation. So you actually got to construct your object before you sit on it, whereas the breath's always there. So that's the advantage of the breath. And so then I thought, oh, nimitta, you're not constructing this thing, right? So it's not like a visualization. So it has the advantage that the breath had, because the breath is always there, and the nimitta seems to be there when it arises. It's not like you're constructing it. So it has the advantage of you don't have to construct it. It's there like the breath, and then you can, but it's still mental consciousness, so you can develop that deep concentration. So that was some extrapolating I was doing. Do you think that's fair, or?
Yeah, I do think that's fair.
Okay.
I do think that's fair. But I also think that people who love meditation will probably at different times want to cultivate different objects.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, to become really skilled in the object, I think it's necessary to explore a variety of objects so that we understand how we relate to physical perceptions, how we relate to mental perceptions, how we can hold a perception in such a way within the mind that stabilizes concentration, which is slightly different than how we hold an object for insight practice, because then we would want to penetrate its nature of arising and passing, or see its empty. Its emptiness. But we work with then how we hold that object. So I like to teach first with the breath, maybe just because I just find there's something kind of quite honest about starting with the breath. Or feel the breath, and we're there, and we can work out a lot of the hindrances in just simply by settling the attention on the breath. So I quite like to teach first from the perspective of the breath, and I usually, in most of my personal retreats, also start with the breath. But then I go on to explore other objects for concentration. Some I explored in Wisdom Wide and Deep. I taught all the different, what are called kasina practices of colors and elements as concentration objects. Or loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, what are called the Brahma Viharas as concentration objects. And after I've worked with students, I find that some people do have an aptitude for other objects that are really better for them than the breath. And that's fine. But usually by having worked with some of the issues that come up with the breath as the object, they've already learned something. And so I think it's a really good place to start for anybody who wants to deepen concentration, and to not go out trying to figure out what one's perfect object is, because the point is that we just need to really work with whatever distractions and hindrances and defilements arise, and keep our minds from being able to settle into an experience of calm, clear peace.
So I was thinking that now, so we sort of talked about nimitta, and this is like thought of as access, a way of accessing the first jhana. So maybe if you could speak about what the first jhana is, and then in terms of how that might be used for insight practice.
Well, first I'd like to say something else, though, about the understanding of samadhi and concentration.
Okay. Yes, please.
Sometimes there's a misunderstanding about the different kinds of concentration, and sometimes one thinks that the concentration that arises with changing objects, which in Pali is called khanika samadhi, is a weaker form of concentration. And then the next level up would be access concentration, or what's called upachara samadhi. And then that is like at the doorway towards jhana, which is absorptive concentration, a form of apana samadhi. And that there's a kind of hierarchy of strength. I don't like to think about it that way. I think there's some misunderstanding in there, because khanika samadhi can be tremendously deep and profound. In fact, it must be, to see the arising and passing of phenomena, to really see the changing nature of body and mind,
Yeah.
The mind has to be deeply concentrated.
Yeah.
And because the nature of the object for insight practice is the changing nature of body and
Yeah.
mind, that's what we're observing.
Yeah.
We could call it the five aggregates of clinging, the five clinging aggregates, or we could, in Buddhist terminology, or we could call it the sense bases, or we could just say body and mind, or we could say changing experiences. We could call it various things and see it from various kind of structures. But it's phenomena constantly changing, free from the concepts that solidify an idea about it as a fixed anything. And so the mind has got to be concentrated. So first of all, I think it's very important to realize that Khanika Samadhi, the concentration that arises with insight practice or with any time we're observing the changing nature of mind and body, is strong concentration. And it would be a mistake to think that it's in any way lesser or weaker than the concentration that arises with a fixed object.
Yeah.
But we have then, when we look at the object,
Yeah.
when we're looking at the object of perception being the changing nature of mind and body, the kind of concentration and samadhi that develops when we're steadily observing that is called Khanika Samadhi. When we take a fixed object like a color, an element, a quality, a mental state, or a nimitta, concentration, and concentrate on that, then because of the nature of that object, we develop a different quality of concentration. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is better than or more than or deeper than.
Yeah, for sure. And I could think that the one on the changing nature of the body, because the object is changing, it could even be more difficult to hold that object versus an object that's very stable. And so like it's not necessarily a level of difficulty thing either, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, we have to look at how steady the mind is to perceive that object in a steady way. Now, I really enjoy the concentration practices that lead to jhana.
Yes.
There's kind of a step-by-step deepening that allows me to gradually and clearly and quite precisely modulate the quality of concentration and samadhi that I develop.
Yeah.
And then apply that to insight meditation.
Yes.
So I move back and forth between the samadhi practices and the insight meditation practices because it depends upon which object I pick up. So it depends on what I'm perceiving. So if I choose to strengthen just that stability of mind, and with that experience the happiness, the bliss, the peace, the equanimity, that rejuvenating, energizing, strengthening qualities of mind, which are really quite wonderful, and it's delightful and beneficial to the mind and the body, then I can develop that very simply by choosing a stable object that's appropriate for jhana. And then letting the mind rest in these absorption states. I use the example in Focused and Fearless of being like sharpening a pencil. So we need to sharpen, we need our equipment to be, if we want to write, we sharpen our pencil. We need our equipment to be malleable, to be workable, to be refined. And so anybody who does any work with tools will give care to how they keep their tools and how they sharpen their tools and how they prepare their tools, because the nature of the tool is going to help them do the work they want to do. So as somebody on the Dhamma path, I want to see and know the nature of things, so that there is no delusion and the mind is free from any kind of distortion that leads to clinging and grasping and craving. I want to free the mind from the causes of suffering.
Yeah.
So that demands that I refine the mind enough so that I can see the causes of suffering, and then free the mind from those causes of suffering.
Yes.
So the concentration practice then enables me to strengthen the mind, kind of rejuvenate it energetically with the blissful states that are associated with jhana, and then emerge from those states and and use the strength of that concentrated mind to explore the nature of the changing nature, the impermanent nature, the empty nature of body and mind. So it's like sharpening the pencil. The concentration I associate I compare to sharpening the pencil, and then the insight practice I compare to using the pencil to write. If we only sharpen,
No
what's
point
the
in
point?
sharpening.
Exactly. So I'd never encourage anybody to just hang out in jhana.
Jhana,
That is not the purpose of the Dhamma path.
Yeah.
But if you want to write really well, you got to have a sharp pencil.
Yeah.
Well, at least you got to have a pencil that writes. At some point, it gets too dull and you can't write anything.
Yeah.
So you have to keep the pencil sharp to use it to write. You have to keep the mind balanced, steady, clear, and apply it to liberating insight. And liberating insight is not so easy. Sometimes we get tired and we need to rest, so we can drop into jhana. Sometimes things are changing really fast and we don't want to have the mind become dulled. So we can move back and forth. By having skill in the object, we can move back and forth between observing the changing nature of the body and the body as material elements, or we can work with mental states, wholesome states, unwholesome states. We've got to understand it all. If we want to be free, we can't just pretend like, oh, I'm a spiritual person because I like to meditate. We have to really be able to recognize and know how maybe a defilement arose. Maybe there was some irritation or some lust or some greed arose. Well, we got to recognize that and work with it really directly and really honestly. But we also need to know when generosity arises or when kindness and compassion arises to be able to enhance that. So we're learning to very quickly recognize and work with and understand the unwholesome just as much as the wholesome. So we're abandoning the hindrances and we're cultivating the factors of awakening. And then in this process, seeing all of it, everything, constantly changing and utterly empty, until at some point the mind gets fed up with all of that seeking of stimulus, all of that wanting one more thing to do, one more thing to feel, one more thing to attach to, one more thing to build a self around. And then there's the possibility that by seeing this, by seeing the changing nature of experience so clearly, so vividly, so repeatedly, that we finally can release. Release the craving, release the attachments, and experience nibbana, experience the awakened mind. So this path, to me, the jhana practices, it's not that everybody needs to do jhana, and it's not that jhana is the purpose of the path. But I have found that the path is supported immensely, the insight is supported immensely by being able to stabilize the mind with deep concentration.
Can I ask what the object of jhana and the object of insight is? The object of insight here, it seems like you're describing that the actual object of insight is like the mental activities themselves, the wholesome and unwholesome. I guess my question is the object of jhana and the object of insight similar, or is it the same object, or is it different in this tradition?
In this approach, when we undertake the jhana practice, we choose an object. So we might choose the breath or breath nimitta. We might choose a color. We might choose metta, loving kindness. And so each of those are actually concepts. Okay, the breath starts out as a physical sensation, but by the time the mind approaches jhana, it's really a mental experience of the breath, or it's derived from the physical, but it's really a mental concept at that point. So the jhana, for the most part, are mental objects, but they're concepts. They're not what the Buddhist systems of Abhidhamma analysis. The Abhidhamma categorizes experience as concepts in one category, then various mental factors, cetasika is one category, then consciousness, citta is another category, nibbana as another category, and rupa, the body, experiences is another category. So one does not take concepts as the object for vipassana, because concepts are derived, they're constructed through our mind, through our intention. They don't have the nature of arising and passing away. And so when we give steady attention to a concept, the concept becomes lasting.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't think it's permanent. Nobody thinks it's permanent,
moment by moment.
but it's not. It doesn't have the nature of arising and
staying,
passing. So it's neither permanent nor arising and
Yeah.
passing.
Yeah.
It's a concept, so it has
Yeah.
its own way of functioning. Because it's a concept and because it functions that way, when we apply steady attention to it, it can become very steady, and the mind can be absorbed with it. It can be unified with it. It can be. It can have that steadiness.
Yeah.
But the clearer and the more steadily we observe the mind and body, what do we see? We start to see that it's changing.
Yeah, okay.
So
I
the
got it.
more we give our attention to the body and all the various sensory encounters, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or thought, mental processes, then we're not looking at a concept, which might be an object of mind, but we're looking at the mental processes with consciousness and and mental factors, the mental states.
Yeah.
Then what we look at is we see that they're constantly changing. And we know that. We don't even need to do intensive vipassana to know that. I mean, do you have the same emotion that you had at breakfast? Are you experiencing the same mood that you experienced at 2 o'clock yesterday? No. Are you experiencing the same physical sensations that you were experiencing 20 minutes ago? No. It's constantly changing.
Yeah.
So the object for vipassana, the classic language is to say that the object for vipassana is the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. It means we're looking at mind and body.
Yeah.
And the object for jhana is there's a set in the Theravada tradition of suggested and suitable objects.
Yeah.
There are many more objects that can deepen concentration, but for the absorption states of jhana, there's a set of objects that are recommended, and the vast majority of them are concepts.
Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So for jhana, you want the object to be a concept generally because the concepts themselves don't have the nature of moment-to-moment change.
And it's possible for the mind to absorb with the mind.
Yeah, so you link your mind with that, it's very steady, and then you get your absorption. But once you have attained absorption based on the concept or steady object, then what you then in vipassana, you're starting to observe actual moment-to-moment change of feelings, ascertainments, mind and body stuff, basically, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so then that can give you a real insight into impermanence, for example.
Yes.
Okay, and it's not like a conceptual understanding, it's a real actual understanding, right?
Exactly, and that's what makes it liberating, because we all know on a conceptual level, everybody knows the concept of impermanence.
Yes.
Everything changes, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to have meditated to know everything changes.
For sure.
But how many times a day do we forget that?
Yeah.
I mean, we forget that every time we become attached to anything.
Yeah.
Every time we try and make something last, every time we try and make something go away, every time, we forget it.
Yeah.
And we forget it and we forget it. And yet we know it. So what's that about? That's why we need insight.
Yeah.
We need insight to get at a deeper experience of how we relate to mind-body experiences, our perceptions.
And then post-meditation, you have this knowledge and trying to keep that, bring that wisdom into practice. And so the other question I had is, what is your feeling about the average guy in the street being able to, achieve some of these high levels of concentration to take advantage of this practice? Is that something we can, all aim for with our 9-to-5 jobs and that? Or do we have to? Do we need to be putting 3 months aside a year? What's your advice to people?
I think it's a fair question. And everybody is actually different. What is needed? What are the conditions that are needed to attain jhana? Are not always so external. What are the conditions that somebody needs to free the mind from the hindrances? Because basically, to enter jhana, the conditions are that one must be free from the hindrances of desire, aversion, sloth, and torpor, restlessness, and doubt. Basically, the mind has to be steady and clear and strong. The 5 faculties have to be developed of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And basically, the mind needs to be able to have developed the skill to relate to the object of meditation in a way that further deepens the concentration without enhancing conceit. Oh boy, I was with the object. Look at me, I'm such a good meditator.
Yeah.
You know, those kinds of thoughts. Or I really want, I've got to have jhana. You know, craving and conceit, again, more defilements and hindrances. So we have to learn to free the mind from the obstacles and cultivate the faculties, which is a broad form of practice, and then enhance a particular set of factors called the intensifying factors, or the 5 jhana factors, which is the skill in directing the attention and applying it to the object, sustaining the attention on it. That's called in Pali vitaka vichara. And then what's called piti and sukha. Piti is a joy, a rapture, a delight in the object. Sukha is a quality of pleasure that comes with the knowing of the meditation object. So this isn't about like, oh, I'm blissed out because I'm thinking about that chocolate souffle that I had last week. It's not a sensual pleasure. It's not a physical or sensuous experience at all. This is the joy and the pleasure that comes from the knowing of the meditation object, from that connection with the meditation object. And then the last of the jhana factors is the one what's called ekagata, or it's translated as one-pointedness of attention, but it describes the singularity of interest, the unification of mind with that object, so that the mind starts to become very collected, coherent, gathered just with the meditation object. So usually we sit down, we focus on whatever our object is, like the breath. The mind wanders off and we come back. The mind wanders off and we come back. The mind wanders off again and we come back. But at some point the mind no longer wanders off. So the jhana practice gives us a way of developing the practice from the point from when the mind no longer wanders off. And that's when the jhana practice can really be picked up. So what does it take for somebody to get to that point of non-distraction? It's going to depend a lot on a lot of different factors. I mean, I just rattled off a few Buddhist lists. What I want to say, and what I would like listeners to really know, is that this practice is possible. What conditions it's going to take for any individual to attain the first jhana, the second jhana, the third jhana, the fourth jhana, or to master any of those states is really going to vary. But it is available on every 10-day retreat that I teach with lay people. Then it's some people attain jhana, but not everybody. Not everybody, but every retreat some people do. And so some people hear that, they think, oh, I'm going on a jhana retreat, and then they have this idea that they need to get jhana. And I try to teach jhana from the perspective of deepening concentration skills without this expectation that we get this state we want, because that only enhances craving and conceit. But there is value in developing these techniques, whether or not anybody attains that particular state.
Yeah.
Because you don't know if you're going to be among the people who do or don't. Depends on a lot of other conditions.
Yeah.
So what I want people to know is that it is available. One does not have to be a monastic in a Himalayan cave. Now, I knew people who were practicing jhana when I was practicing in the monasteries in Thailand. But they weren't teaching me jhana.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a Western lay woman,
Yeah.
traveling, meditating, trying to do as serious and diligent a practice as I could. I felt as though I was deeply dedicated and had dedicated my life to this practice. But nevertheless, I was a Western woman and a lay person. I didn't ordain. So I never had the opportunity to learn these techniques, even though I was staying in monasteries where monks were doing these techniques. And so I do want to communicate to people in the West that this is available for women as much as men. This is available for lay people as much as monastics. This is available for young people and old people. This is available for anybody. There's no prejudice to keep anybody away from these techniques. It depends upon how we train our minds. But it does involve a training. And it also does involve some degree of external support. For example, I never recommend the jhana practices to people who are doing a lot of emotional work. Like there are times in our lives when we're grieving or when we're working through different layers of emotional processing. We need to then have more the skills of mindfulness and vipassana to work with those. It's not the time to focus just on one particular fixed object. But there are also times in all of our lives, anybody who's had like a long-term practice over decades, there are times when things are pretty calm. There are times when, the hindrances are not a big deal. They're okay, there's a little restlessness here and there, there's a little this and that here and there. But basically we'd say our lives were in a pretty good place and our practice was in a pretty good place. Well, that's a fabulous time to deepen the samadhi. Because then it will enable us to again do the vipassana from a from a stronger position. So we keep throughout our practice, sometimes doing the more stabilizing meditations and sometimes doing the more investigative meditations. And if we can hold a view of practice that includes the stabilizing and the investigative with the clear aim of liberation, then I think we'll be just fine. We'll be able to strengthen and support the practice. We'll be able to explore lots of different things, and we won't stop short or think, oh yeah, I got into the second jhana. This is the be-all and end-all of practice. And we won't confuse temporary states of bliss or temporary states of letting go with the profound liberation that the Buddhist path offers, which really is the ending of greed, hate, and delusion. So, although I don't say that jhana is liberating in the sense that one would be absorbed in jhana and then be free because of the jhana. Jhanas, they liberate the mind from the active components of the hindrances. So the mind does have a sense of liberation from the arising of greed, hate, or delusion, because there's such wholesome states that those unwholesome states can't arise.
They're pressed down, but they're not gone.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think it's a fabulous thing. It's not a bad thing to press them down.
No, not at all.
Because
there's some relief.
We've got to have the relief. Because if we're always fighting the obstacles day in and day out, minute by minute, again and again and again in our practice, and no relief, it's going to be exhausting. But if we can sometimes experience the purity of wholesome states, then we can also see, by the way, that those wholesome states are impermanent. They're unsatisfactory. They're also not self. But we can have insight with the support of a wholesome state instead of always having to struggle with the unwholesome state. So they provide this balancing feature to our practice.
Very nice. Thank you so much. That was very, I think that everyone will find that very encouraging, and that this sort of practice is available. It takes, work and discipline, but it's totally available to anyone who wants to apply themselves to it. So I think that's encouraging, and I can't recommend enough your book, Focused and Fearless, and I can't myself wait to get into Wisdom Wide and Deep. And so then I was wondering, and if there's any other resources that you have online that people might be able to go to and find out more about your approach to meditation.
Sure. I'd like to say just a word to orient people to the books.
Yes,
and then,
please do.
The first is that Focused and Fearless I would recommend for most people to read first, simply because it uses the breath as the primary object to deepen concentration with a lot of exercises that can be applied in ordinary daily life. So earlier you used the phrase post-meditation, and
yes,
post-meditation. What's after meditation? Maybe all of life is meditation.
All of life, yeah.
Maybe meditation might not be contained in just the stillness of the posture, but maybe there's a way of living that is utterly meditative.
Yeah.
And I include a lot of daily life reflections and ways to support and strengthen concentration and the conditions that support concentration in the context of relationships and work and family and ordinary daily life.
Yeah.
And so that is included how to work with emotions, how to work with various qualities, how to establish equanimity and happiness, and work with all those factors are encouraged and explored in Focused and Fearless. And then the initial instructions on the detailed instructions on establishing absorption is given, and then it goes on to teach the 4 jhanas and the formless attainments, and also applying them to insight practice. So that's Focused and Fearless. Now, Wisdom Wide and Deep is slightly different. I would say that Wisdom Wide and Deep is a more advanced book. I would recommend that people have done some meditation practice. Focused and Fearless, I think beginners can benefit by it. But for Wisdom Wide and Deep, I'd recommend that somebody have done some retreat practice before reading it. I think they get a lot more out of it. And it presents the teaching that I learned from my Burmese teacher, Venerable Pawak Sayadaw. And he has a very systematic method that goes into it's a very clear training on using all the various objects for concentration that are offered in the Theravada tradition. So he trained me in the 40 objects for concentration and samadhi practices. So I give the instructions on using all of those practices, all the kasinas, all the using elements, colors, using the Brahma Viharas of loving kindness, compassion, and how to attain jhana based upon those. We do the body meditations, the death reflections, and that's all contained in the first half of the book. But then the second half of the book goes into some of the practices that we do to explore insight meditation with a lot more detail. And so the body is not just felt as sensation, but we explore the nuances of a detailed approach to the elements of the body. And similarly, we look at mental states, not just as coarse emotions, but we break down each mental state into to see how that moment of experience is perceived and cognized. So we look very, very carefully at the mind. So it's an introduction, in a way, to the Buddhist psychology of Abhidhamma. And we look at the causal relations through the dependent arising cycle, and then apply that to the sequence of insight practices that lead through the 16 knowledges and culminate in the experience of Nibbana. So it presents, Wisdom Wide and Deep presents a comprehensive path of samadhi and vipassana that is leading very explicitly, almost in a step-by-step way, to the liberating experience of Nibbana.
Fantastic. And so you recommend that people start with Focused and Fearless. It's quite, I think, quite approachable, this book. But then once someone's got a bit of, meditation experience under their belt, then Wisdom Wide and Deep would be something that would be helpful for them. So people should go check that out. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Shaila Catherine. And if you did, make sure you go to iTunes and give us a rating, or to your favorite podcasting app. We really appreciate those ratings. Another thing you might want to do is go to wisdompubs.org/podcast, and there you can leave us a comment. You can tell us about who you'd like us to interview, who are some of your favorite Buddhist thinkers that you'd love to see on the Wisdom Podcast, and what sort of questions would you like us to ask. Next week, we're excited to announce that we're joined by one of the pioneers of Buddhism in the West. Joseph Goldstein will be joining us for a wonderful conversation about his encountering the Dharma and his journey to becoming one of the leading Buddhist teachers in the West today.
In the Burmese tradition, enlightenment or nibbana or the unconditioned is beyond awareness. Awareness is seen as another conditioned state.
Yeah.
In Dzogchen, and also I think perhaps somewhat in the Thai tradition in Theravada, they view an unconditioned awareness.
Yeah.
So here I was, having spent, 20, 30 years immersed in one system. The unconditioned is beyond awareness.
Yes.
And here are these great teachings. No, there's an unconditioned awareness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was...
You were like, that doesn't compute.
Exactly. It didn't compute at all, and I was going back and forth. Who's right?